love now and
Did you
always.
I love her?
Love is stronger than anything.
You feel the love?
And I love you more than anything.
There's still love.
From the New York Times, I'm Anna Martin. This is Modern Love. Growing up, I loved to watch my parents. I noticed small things, like whenever my mom would get up from the dinner table, my dad would stand up too. When we watched a movie, they'd sit next to each other on the couch so my mom could easily scratch my dad's head. And when we were in the car, they'd bicker over each other's driving and then apologize before we even got out. It made me think, okay, this is what a marriage is. This is what it means to love someone for life. And I knew that I wanted that someday. Today's essay is by a woman who also spent her whole life observing her parents, especially her mother. But what she saw made her not want to get married. Ever. Natasha Singh, welcome to Modern Love.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You wrote a Modern Love essay almost 14 years ago about your parents' marriage, and it opens with your mom celebrating this one Hindu ritual. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, it's called Karva Chauth, and it's a ritual where Hindu wives traditionally spend a day praying for the longevity of their husbands' lives, and it requires fasting from sunrise to moonrise.
So I'm going to ask you to read from your essay a couple times, but I want to start with this part where you talk about how this ritual happened in your family. Can you read that part for me?
Sure. My parents' fates were tied together 40 years ago in an arranged marriage in India. On each Karva Chauth since then, my mother has dressed in her red wedding sari and lost herself in the world of preparations. Her entire day is spent over the stove in front of her shrine of gods and goddesses. Usually she makes my father's favorite dishes along with puri, samosas, chole, and sweets. When I was a child growing up in a tiny Canadian mountain town where we were the only Indian immigrants, she used to tell me, "This is a day to honor my husband. Only when you are married will I tell you more."
You also write that you felt like this holiday was magical. What about it was so enchanting to you?
What enchanted me was the way that my mother dressed. She wore this beautiful red and gold wedding sari, and she looked very regal, almost like a queen to me. And so she would stand in front of her gods and goddesses and in front of her altar, and the altar was actually in the kitchen cupboard for a kitchen. So she would stand there.
You gotta put it somewhere, yeah.
I gotta put it somewhere. And she also just mouthed a lot of prayers, and I sometimes heard her whispering for my father's safety and his well-being and his longevity. So for me, I was just witnessing something.
When did your parents get married?
I think in 1966 or 67, a couple of years before they immigrated. And my mother, her father had died in her early 20s, and she had really fought to be educated and had become a teacher and never wanted to marry. And so my mother wasn't aware that her marriage was being arranged. So she was sort of tricked into her marriage, and my father knew. And she tells me this story about my father, and my mother never noticed that he had a glass eye, and she didn't even notice that he was 16 years older than her. No one had told her any of these things. And so she came to find out about it on the day of her wedding. And when my father learned that no one had told her, he said to her, "You can leave. You can go back to your family. This marriage can be over." And my mother looked at my father and said, "We're married now. I will never leave your side." And that was that. And I think my mom made a choice in that moment.
What do you understand your mom was choosing between? What was the choice she was making in that moment?
I think when I was really young, I believed that she had no choices, and that affected me deeply. Whereas when I got older, I realized that once you're married or once you're engaged, for a woman in India at that time, even if she were to have gone home, her life would have been ruined. She would have just been deemed spoiled goods, or people would have just like had a lot of stigma attached to her.
Right.
But as a child, I definitely knew that that my parents' marriage was very different than anybody else's marriage. I mean, we were the only brown people in this town of white people. And so when you grow up watching a lot of white folk touching and being affectionate and kissing one another on their front lawns, like I know my dad would always comment and have something horrible to say about that. So I think I always noticed that there was a difference between how they didn't run into each other's arms. That wasn't their beginning. But they made a life together.
Oh, I think that's a phone on your end. Let's just pause for one sec.
Sorry.
No. You got people calling.
Sorry, that was my mom.
I'm glad.
I think
That was your mom?
I think she must have sensed we were talking about her.
No way. Okay, so Natasha, you spent your childhood watching your parents and their marriage, knowing that it was arranged. Growing up, did your parents want you to have an arranged marriage like theirs or a love marriage?
My parents, I think their hopes were that I would have a marriage based on their choice. But I also think because I was such a rebellious teenager that they quickly gave up hopes that my marriage would be arranged or that I would ever get married at all. I had zero interest in the institution of marriage for a very long time because our home was very traditional. My mother never stepped out of a sari. She never wore pants. She always had her hair braided. She always wore a bindi. There was so much control over my mobility and my body, and I wanted freedom.
Tell me about rebellious young you. How did that manifest, your rebellion?
Oh, well, it manifested. It manifested in me, I think, shaving my head bald at 13. And
that's young.
Yeah, that's young. And running away from home, carrying a switchblade, thinking I was uber tough, playing with gender expression. I think I wanted the kind of power that my father as a male exerted at home, a kind of domination. I think I left home at 17 for good and hitchhiked everywhere. But I wasn't your conventional Indian daughter. And I think that was very, very difficult for my parents.
As you got older, you're living this wilder, this freer life. Would your parents even touch the question of marriage with you, or was that so off the table they would not raise it?
Oh, all the time.
Okay.
I mean, they
So no, they were still talking to you about it. Okay.
They were talking about marriage, and if when they went to India, they'd casually ask around. Other people approached them to express interest in us. I was certainly always very dismissive. I was also lesbian identified, and so I was in a relationship with another woman for many years, and so they just didn't know what to say to that. You can't really say anything.
Did you formally come out to your parents when you were in your teens, or when did that happen?
I came out to my mom when I was 19 or 20. She'd actually called to complain or express her worries about her fear that another woman that she knew was a lesbian. And so she was calling to sort of work this idea out and complaining. And I finally just said, "Ma, I'm the lesbian." And I think she was so horrified because she said to me, "You're so selfish. You don't care about what I want. All you think about is yourself." And she never did tell my father. She always said that the information would kill him. She thought that it was very dirty and gross. So there was that element as well. I just felt sad. It would have been lovely to have her support. And I also recognized that she didn't have a lot of tools or resources at the time with which to support me the way that I needed to be supported. I never used my parents' worldviews as a metric for my self-worth. But I also knew their future for me had no resonance with me whatsoever.
Okay, but I mean, you do write about this one moment that you saw years later that did resonate for you. Your father had been very sick. Your mom was terrified he wasn't going to make it, but he did eventually get better. And you kind of stumbled into this intimate moment between them after his recovery. Can you read that part of your essay for me?
Sure. The only time I ever saw my father touching my mother was when they'd first moved to Vancouver, British Columbia. The night I discovered them touching, I was startled into staring. There in the living room, my mother was sitting on the couch, reading my father this prayer while he sat on the floor near her feet, his head on her lap. One of her hands patted his head as she read. It was a tender, sacred moment, and I backed away quickly as if I had come upon them naked and writhing beneath the brilliant light. I like to tell myself that there must have been many more moments like that, but I highly doubt it. The space between my parents' bodies is large like a vacant room, a vast tract of barren land, though my sister, brother, and I are proof of a certain kind of flowering. Surely, there has to be more evidence than us.
It's such a striking scene. Between your parents, there's so much tenderness there. But you wrote that you were startled, that you backed away, which is a really strong, almost jarring reaction. Why did you respond that way?
Because my parents were so private. I felt that they wouldn't have wanted me to be watching them, that moment was for them. I was startled, I think, because I certainly had never seen anything like that, and it disrupted the story I had about affection and touch between them.
Mm-hmm. And the story you'd had about their affection was what?
That there was none. That there was no touch.
Mm-hmm. And this moment, so natural, so tender, almost so unthinking, it sounds like, from what you wrote.
Yeah.
Proved to you that you might have missed something? You might have misunderstood in some way?
That I might have misunderstood, that I might have overlaid a narrative onto theirs that had more to do with my projections and assumptions. And I think it's very difficult when you grow up in this part of the world to not internalize some of the stories people have about South Asians. It's very easy to cast a brown woman as a victim who has no agency and who has no choice. And I think I did a little bit of that. So seeing their marriage and their relationship evolve over the years has, given me a greater appreciation for them and their love.
After the break, Natasha does the thing she said she'd never do. She gets married. That's next. Natasha, you watched your parents' marriage for most of your life, and it convinced you that marriage and also that men were just not for you. So tell me how you ended up getting married to a man.
Well, I met Branly when we were in grad school, and we met through mutual friends, and there was something there. The irony is my girlfriend at the time met him, had come down from Canada to attend my graduation, and Branly was there. And I remember her looking at him and looking at me and saying, if ever you go back to men, I think this is the guy for you. And I completely dismissed that because he was just so nice. I wasn't ready for that because I'd had very different kinds of relationships with maleness and men and power and violence in my life. And so I wasn't that interested. But one of the clinchers for me was I was heading to the airport to go back to Canada, and he helped me put my luggage in the trunk of this taxi. And as I was leaving, he looked at me and he folded his hands together and he said, "Namaste, Natasha ji." And Branly's not Indian, he's Haitian, and I have heard namaste my entire life, but there was something about the way that he said that just pierced my heart, and I sobbed all the way to the airport without knowing why.
Oh,
And it wasn't until years later, after we were both single and, just happened to be connecting it with one another at the same time, that I just looked at him and he looked at me, and I thought, I think I wasn't ready for it back then. And my parents were thrilled, absolutely thrilled. In part,
you've met their expectations in one way, at least. Yeah.
I think I went way beyond their expectations. One, they never thought I would be getting married. And I will say that I opposed the institution of marriage for many years. Branly did end up asking me to marry him, but he did it. Oddly enough, it's a very embarrassing story for him, but I was at work and he called me on the phone and he said, if I asked you to marry me, would you say yes? And I felt this joy bubbling up inside of me. And I said, yes, I'll marry you. But he says on the phone, let's not tell anybody for a year. Let's just hold this for ourselves. And I come home and my mom calls me. And my mom's kind of psychic about these kinds of things.
I mean, she called during our interview. Yeah.
Exactly. So she calls and she says, "Are you getting married?" And I said, "What?" I didn't lie to her. I couldn't. And so I said, "Yes." And within 45 minutes, I think she'd called everybody under the sun to announce that we were getting married.
She's so happy about it. Oh my gosh.
She was thrilled. But then when Branly comes home, I'm expecting him to show up with flowers, with something. And instead he goes to the refrigerator and opens it up. And I'm like, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm getting food." And I said, "What? Is this it?" And he said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, I told my mom." And he said, "About what?" And I said, "That we're getting married." And he said, "What?" He said, "Natasha, I was asking you hypothetically."
Oh, no.
It was a bit mortifying for both. Yeah, but by then everybody knew. And so
you kind of had to do it.
But we had some starts and stops with our marriage process. But I will say that we ended up saying we're going to plan it for this date. And then we ended up calling it off. And I realized that I was still resistant. And part of my resistance was really rooted in a deep sense of guilt for being able to have a choice and for being able to really have agency and pick somebody and be with someone that I really loved and who really loved me. And I had to really mourn a lot around my mother's life, around the other stories of the women in my bloodline, before I could really say yes, and before Branly and I could take that step together.
Did you know what you were mourning? Did you know what that grief was for?
There's stories that we hear. So I heard about my mom and her sisters had child marriages, and I heard about my grandmother who lived with us for the first 5 years of my life. My paternal grandmother had been forced to marry her brother-in-law, and I always heard stories about the ways in which she was abused by my grandfather. And I remember coming home one day and Branly saying, "You look so upset, you look so scared." And I just felt like all of this grief in my belly. And he just said, "Here's a pillow, and I want you to just cry into it or scream as loudly as you want, and I'm right here." And I just found myself wailing. And he just sat there with his hand on my back. And I think prior to moments like that, I think I was very afraid that I would be trapped. And I think his ability to just say, "I'm here," it helped me step into a sense of possibility.
It gave you a sort of foreshadowing, perhaps, of what the dynamic of your marriage would be like.
Yeah, positive foreshadowing. Yeah, yeah.
Do you feel like being married and being a wife means something different to you than it does to your mom?
I have to tell you, I don't really like the word wife.
I love that. Tell me about why.
Maybe it comes from my days as being in a radical feminist lesbian community. It just creeps me out.
Totally. It doesn't fit for you. Yeah.
It doesn't. And I think in part it has had, for me, connotations of property.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just feel like partnership is more true to how I conceive of my life together with Branly.
Mm-hmm. You've had a big change in your family recently. Your father passed away, which must have been so hard for your mom. And that is, in another way, a sort of change in their marriage. How did she handle that?
I will say that my mom was very shocked. Her mourning was very loud. And the way that I think about it is that it filled the whole house, it filled the skies, it seemed to drown everything out. Part of her grief included literally staring at his picture for long periods of time and asking, "Why did you leave me?" I just said, "Ma, maybe it's time you tried asking Dad a different question." And so now she's practicing asking him, "Can you show me you're here?" Or "Can you bless us from wherever you are?" And that, I think, has shifted some things for her. And she'll say to me, "Beta, I go to our bedroom and I close the door and I lock it at around 7 or 8 at night. And then your father's just with me and we are okay. And I feel safe." I think, and he's still present and alive in her prayers and her rituals. It's just that he's not there in form.
You spent so much of your life observing your parents' marriage. I want to know, what did they show you about what it means to love someone?
They're very devoted to each other. I mean, I think they never left each other's side. I can count the number of days that they spent apart in their over 50 years of marriage. I don't necessarily live like they do at all, but it's more the quality of respect. My father was always very respectful towards my mother and never spoke ill of her. And in later life, in the last years of their lives together, sometimes I would wake up and he would be touching her feet, which is a sign of devotion in our culture. And my mother would be asleep, and I would see this early in the morning, and he would sometimes bow his head to her feet, and he treated her like she was a goddess. And I feel like my husband treats me, or my partner, Branly, treats me that way. There's a reverence and a devotion, and I feel that towards him as well. And I think there's something about this quality of loving devotion that my parents have modeled, and that has been a beautiful influence on my life with my partner.
Natasha, thank you so much for this conversation today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your beautiful questions.
We love that you listen to the show, and we want to hear from you. Email us with your observations, your questions, your comments. We read every single email and listen to every single voice memo you send us. You can reach us at modernlovepodcast@nytimes.com. Modern Love is produced by Julia Botero, Christina Josa, and Hans Butow. It's edited by Sarah Saracen. Our executive producer is Jen Poyant. This episode was mixed by Sophia Landman. Our show is recorded by Maddie Masiello. The Modern Love theme music is by Dan Powell. Original music by Marian Lozano and Pat McCusker. Digital production by Mahima Chablani and Nel Galogli. The Modern Love column is edited by Daniel Jones. Mia Lee is the editor of Modern Love Projects. I'm Anna Martin. Thanks for listening.